The scene is the same every year, painted on millions of greeting cards, carved into the wood panels above millions of altars. 3 figures in rich robes, gold, frankincense, myrrh, kneeling in the lamplight of the stable in Bethlehem. 3 kings from the Orient following a star. We have seen it 1,000 times. There is warmth in it. The wide, cold sky above Judea, the smell of straw, a child, and the whole world converging on a single stable. I grew up with that scene. I said we 3 kings in every Christmas pageant I can remember. I was probably a shepherd 3 or 4 times, and a wise man at least once, wearing a bathrobe and a crown my mother made out of cardboard and gold paint. I believed, without ever stopping to check, that Matthew chapter 2 told the story of 3 wise men, 3 kings, 3 monarchs from the ancient East, paying homage to a newborn king. So I want to tell you something. Matthew chapter 2 verse 1. The text in Greek, magoi apo anatolon pareginonto eis Hierosolima. Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. That is the whole description. No number, no royal title, no crowns, no names. Matthew does not say 3, he does not say kings, he does not say wise men. He uses one word and one word only to identify these figures, and that one word, magoi, carries more explosive cargo than most people sitting in Christmas morning pews have ever been told. The question I want to spend some time with today is this: who were the magoi? Because Spinoza's method, reading a text the way you read a document, looking at what it actually says rather than what tradition needs it to say, reveals an identity that the church has been quietly setting aside for 2,000 years. Stay with me on this. The word magoi is Greek, but it is not originally a Greek word. It is a direct transliteration of the old Persian magush. That is not a scholarly technicality. It matters enormously, because the Persian magush had a specific, well-documented meaning in the ancient world, and it had nothing to do with royal courts or wisdom literature or diplomatic missions. The magush were a priestly caste, specialists in the observation and interpretation of celestial signs, practitioners of Zoroastrian religious ritual, and every educated person in the 1st century Mediterranean world understood exactly what the word meant. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BC, 500 years before Matthew, is the first major source to describe the Magi in detail. In his histories, Herodotus identifies them as a distinct tribe of the Medes, one of the great ancient peoples of what is now Iran, whose specific religious and social role was the observation of the sky and the interpretation of dreams and omens. They were not soldiers. They were not merchants. They were not kings or courtiers. They were a hereditary priestly class whose entire professional identity was built around reading signs in the natural world and declaring what those signs meant. Strabo, writing his geography in the 1st century BC, is equally precise. He describes the Magi as a distinct Persian tribal group with their own religious customs, their own ritual practices, and their own system of interpretation. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, finished around 77 AD, roughly contemporaneous with the writing of Matthew's Gospel, names them directly as practitioners of what he calls the art of the Magi, a sophisticated system of religious observation with ancient Persian roots that he traces back well before Alexander the Great. The Encyclopedia Iranica, the modern academic reference on ancient Persian civilization, describes the Magi as the guardians of the Zoroastrian sacred fire. They performed the rituals, they interpreted the sacred texts, they read the heavens. They were professionals in a religious tradition that predated Christianity by at least 1,000 years. Now here is what I need you to hold in your mind for the next few minutes. A literate Jewish person in the 1st century, hearing the word magoi spoken aloud, would have known immediately what those figures were. Not kings, not ambassadors, not philosophers, pagan priests, practitioners of a foreign religion, men whose entire professional identity consisted of doing things the Torah of Moses explicitly, not implicitly, not by suggestion, but explicitly condemned. That is witness 1 in the case Spinoza's method builds here, the historians themselves. Herodotus, Strabo, Pliny the Elder, the Encyclopedia Iranica, across 2.5 millennia of scholarship. They all agree on what the word means, and what it means changes everything about how the opening of Matthew's Gospel should be read. Matthew is the most Jewish of the four Gospels. I want to be precise about what that means, because it matters for what comes next. Matthew quotes the Hebrew scriptures more than 40 times, more than Mark, more than Luke, more than John. He uses a formula, repeated through the entire text like a drumbeat. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, the prophet Jeremiah, the prophet Micah. Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience that knows its Torah, and he is making an argument in a language that audience understands. The life of Jesus fulfills the Hebrew scriptures, point by point, page by page. Matthew knows the Torah. He knows it deeply. He deploys it constantly. And in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 10 through 12, the Torah Matthew quotes throughout his entire gospel lists the exact practices that define the professional identity of the Magi. Let me read you the passage. "Let no one be found among you who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord." The Hebrew word translated there as detestable, toevah, is not a mild word. It is one of the strongest condemnation words in the entire biblical vocabulary. It is the same word used in Leviticus for the most serious ritual violations the Torah condemns. Toevah, abomination. Not a metaphor, not rhetorical emphasis. The actual category of the worst ritual crimes. And the list in Deuteronomy includes divination, the interpretation of omens, the reading of signs, practices connected directly to what we would call astrology and augury, the interpretation of natural phenomena, including celestial phenomena, as messages about the divine will. That is precisely what the Magi did for a living. There is a second passage Matthew's audience would have heard alongside the first. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 26. "Do not practice divination or seek omens." The Hebrew word for seek omens there derives from the same root as the word for serpent. It carries a weight of darkness, of what the covenant people of Israel are supposed to have left behind. Matthew cites Deuteronomy multiple times in his gospel. He cites Leviticus. He knows these texts. He uses them as theological weapons throughout his narrative. And he opens his gospel, in the very first scene featuring any character other than Joseph and Mary, with a delegation of men who practice exactly what those passages condemn. This is not a footnote. This is not a marginal detail. This is the opening of Matthew's story. I need you to hear this clearly, because it is the center of what Spinoza's method reveals. Matthew did not make a mistake. He did not fail to notice that his distinguished visitors were exactly the kind of people his own Torah classified as an abomination. The most Jewish of the four evangelists, writing to an audience that knew its scripture by heart, used a word that any literate Jewish person in the first century would have heard as a flare going up in the night sky. That is witness 2. The Torah of Moses, as cited by Matthew himself, condemns the professional practice of Matthew's opening protagonists in passages Matthew knew and used throughout his gospel. That is not an accident. That is a design. The Magi did not follow a star by accident. Following a star is not what they happened to do. Reading the sky was their professional practice, what they were trained for, what they were paid for, what their entire priestly identity was built around for generations. Johannes Kepler, in 1603 and 1606, was the first person in the modern scholarly record to propose what the Magi might have been reading. He had noticed a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in his own time, and tracing backward through the mathematics of planetary motion, he identified a triple conjunction, Jupiter and Saturn meeting 3 times in the same sign, occurring in the year 7 BC, roughly 2 years before the earliest plausible dating of the Nativity. In the astrological framework of ancient Babylon and Persia, the framework the Magi would have been trained in, the symbolism of that conjunction was not ambiguous. Jupiter was the king planet, associated with universal sovereignty. Saturn was associated with the Jewish people and the land of Palestine. The sign they met in was Pisces, the sign connected in Babylonian cosmology to the end of an age, the turning of a great cycle. Read that through the eyes of a Zoroastrian priest astrologer in the late 1st century BC. Jupiter and Saturn together in Pisces, the king planet and the Jewish planet in the sign of endings and beginnings. Raymond Brown, in his Birth of the Messiah, calls the Kepler conjunction hypothesis not outside the realm of possibility. That is careful academic language. What it means is, this fits. But I want to tell you how I found Brown's deeper insight. Because the context matters. My wife Elaine died in November. The first Christmas after that was the kind of quiet that has weight to it, the silence of a house that had been a certain way for 41 years and was now different in every room. I did not go to Christmas Eve service that year. I sat in my office with the desk lamp on and the house still, and I read. I had Brown's Birth of the Messiah on the desk. I had been working through it for months, a few pages at a time. On Christmas Day, sometime in the middle of the afternoon, I reached the section on Matthew chapter 2, and there was a sentence that stopped me cold. Brown wrote, "Matthew is above all a theologian, not a historian." I read it twice. Then I sat back in my chair. I have a small nativity set on the shelf in that office. My wife collected them. We had 5 or 6 from different countries, different styles. The one that stayed on that shelf is ceramic Italian, the one we bought on a trip together in our 20s. The 3 kings in their robes, the star above the stable. I had looked at it without really seeing it for 15 years. I looked at it differently then, not with anger, not with the feeling that something had been taken from me, with something quieter, the specific sensation of a familiar image that has not changed, but that you can no longer see only in the way you saw it before. It was the same ceramic figures. It was not quite the same story. Brown's argument is this: Matthew constructed the nativity narrative with deliberate theological intention. The Magi are not historical characters whose journey Matthew recorded. They are theological figures Matthew placed at the opening of his gospel to make an argument. And the argument he was making, a Jewish theologian writing to a Jewish audience that knew its Torah, was radical in a way that the translation 3 wise men has been covering up for 400 years. Because here is what happens in Matthew's account. The scribes and the chief priests, when Herod asks them where the Messiah is to be born, know the answer immediately. Bethlehem, it is written in the prophets. They cite Micah chapter 5 without hesitation. They have the scripture, they know the text, and they go nowhere. They brief Herod. The Magi, by contrast, have no Torah. They have no covenant. They have the sky above Persia and the professional training to read it. They followed what was there, they came. The people who knew the text did not find the child. The people who read the sky did. That, Brown argues, is Matthew's theology. Deliberate, constructed, shocking in the 1st century in ways that the words wise men have been obscuring ever since. Raymond Brown was born in 1928 and died in 1998. He was a Sulpician priest, an ordained Catholic father, and for most of his career, he held a joint appointment at Johns Hopkins University and Union Theological Seminary in New York. He was a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission in Rome and was widely regarded across Catholic, Protestant, and secular academic lines as the foremost New Testament scholar of the second half of the 20th century. He was not a skeptic writing from outside the tradition. He was a priest writing from inside it, using the same historical critical tools that Spinoza had pioneered 300 years earlier, because those tools are what the evidence requires. Birth of the Messiah runs 752 pages plus appendices. It is not devotional literature. It is scholarship, tracing sources, identifying literary structures, following the evidence without predetermined conclusions. Brown's central finding about the Magi account is stated clearly enough that it cannot be softened without distorting it. There is no independent corroboration of the episode, no Roman census records, no astronomical records identifying a star of unusual behavior, no other Jewish or Roman source from the period describing a Herodian massacre of infants in Bethlehem, an event that would have been noticed, documented, and remembered in the historical record of a region that Josephus covered in considerable detail. The evidence of historical record does not support the nativity episode as reportage. What Brown argues instead is that Matthew composed the Magi story from elements available in the Hebrew scriptural tradition and from his own theological convictions about who Jesus was and what his coming meant. The episode is Midrash, the Jewish interpretive practice of taking existing scripture and extending it, using it as a lens for understanding new events. Matthew had a theological argument to make, and he made it through narrative. And the theological argument centers entirely on who the Magi are. Brown notes what I find to be the most devastating sentence in 752 pages. Matthew reverses the expected hierarchy of revelation. The religious establishment knows the answer. They have the text. They send Herod. The outsiders, the people whose art the Torah calls abomination, follow the light to the house and bow down. The insider knowledge failed to produce recognition. The outsider practice, the forbidden one, produced it. That is not a small theological point. It is a structural statement about who receives revelation and how. Written by the most Jewish of the four evangelists, in the opening chapter of his gospel, using a word that every literate Jewish person in his audience would have heard as deliberate provocation. Raymond Brown, Sulpician priest, member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission. Matthew designed this. The pagan astrologers are there on purpose. That is witness 3. Baruch Spinoza published the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in Amsterdam in 1670. No name on the title page, no city, a false publisher's imprint. Because the previous person in Amsterdam who had published serious criticism of received religious doctrine had been found dead in a canal. And Spinoza was not speaking in metaphor. He published anyway. Chapter 6 of the Tractatus deals with miracles. Spinoza's argument is careful and does not need to be made dramatic. Nothing that happens in the world can violate the eternal, fixed order of nature. What the texts call miracles are either natural events that the authors did not understand well enough to explain, or they are narrative devices, things described as miraculous because the authors wanted to convey a theological truth, not a meteorological report. The star the Magi followed is not a problem in this framework. It does not need to be miraculous. The conjunction of planets in a sign the Magi interpreted as significant is a natural astronomical event. If you follow Kepler's calculation, the conjunction of 7 BC was real. It happened in the sky above the ancient world. A Zoroastrian astronomer priest, trained in the reading of celestial signs, would have had specific professional things to say about what Jupiter and Saturn in Pisces portended. That reading, that specifically pagan, specifically Zoroastrian, specifically Torah-condemned reading of the sky, is, in Brown's analysis, the mechanical instrument of Matthew's narrative. The vehicle through which the revelation is delivered to the Gentile world is the forbidden cosmology of the Persian priests. Chapter 7 of the Tractatus gives Spinoza's method for reading scripture. Interpret scripture the way you interpret nature, empirically, contextually, without importing the conclusions the institution needs. What does the text actually say? What did the words mean to the people who first heard them? What is the structure of the argument? Applied here, the method produces something Spinoza himself would have recognized in his bones. He spent his entire intellectual life outside the institution, excommunicated at 23, published anonymously, died at 44 in a rented room in The Hague. Everything he found by reading the text straight, without the overlay of what the institution required him to find. The synagogue did not give him his tools. His tools came from the same place the Magi's tools came from, an outside tradition, applied with rigor, followed wherever it led. The parallel is not decorative, it is structural. The Magi were not inside the covenant. They were not circumcised. They were not Torah observant. They were not in any religious category the Jewish tradition of the 1st century recognized as capable of receiving divine revelation. And they were the first Gentiles in Matthew's Gospel to kneel before Jesus. Spinoza was not inside the community when he produced the work that became the foundation of modern biblical scholarship. He was the outsider who read the text honestly. What the text told him, it told him because he came to it without the protective frame of what the institution needed him to find. The same structure. The outsider receives what the insider, protected by certainty, cannot see. That is witness 4. Now let me show you what happened to the word magoi across 2,000 years of transmission. Because the history of this translation is the history of a disappearing act conducted in plain sight, one careful word at a time. Matthew writes, magoi apo anatalon, Magi from the east. Jerome's Latin Vulgate, completed around 383 CE and authoritative for Western Christianity for over 1,000 years, translates it, Magi ab Oriente, no change, Magi. Jerome was the greatest biblical linguist of the late 4th century. He read Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. He had access to major manuscript collections. He spent years in the desert near Jerusalem to be close to the sources. He understood exactly what the word meant. He kept the word. Then the vernacular translation started. The King James Version of 1611 renders magoi as wise men. Not magi, not priests, not astrologers, not sorcerers. Wise men. A phrase that carries no religious specificity whatsoever. A phrase that could describe a university professor, a rabbi, an elder statesman, a grandfather who gives good advice. A phrase that strips out, in 2 words, the entire religious professional identity that the Greek word carried for its 1st century audience. From wise men, the oral tradition moved further. The 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were interpreted as royal gifts, and the Magi became kings. Not because Matthew called them kings, not because any manuscript calls them kings, because the gifts sounded regal, and because Isaiah chapter 60 verse 3 had written that kings would come to the light of Israel, and because the easiest way to work with the discomfort of pagan astrologers in the birth narrative was to give them crowns and make them something that fit the pageant. 3 wise men became 3 kings. 3 kings became the 3 kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, names that appear in no gospel, that entered the tradition through late antique liturgical elaboration, centuries after Matthew wrote his text, and were eventually treated as historical fact. Matthew does not give them a number. The number 3 was inferred from the 3 gifts. Matthew does not give them names. The names arrived centuries later from sources the manuscripts do not support. Matthew does not give them crowns. The crowns came from the institutional need to make the opening chapter of his gospel presentable. Each step in this process was understandable. Each step was also a step away from the word Matthew actually used, and toward a word the institution could put in a children's pageant. What the Church has been celebrating on the 6th of January for 2,000 years, the Feast of Epiphany, the Day of the Kings, the Dia de Reyes, is the arrival of pagan Zoroastrian astrologers, practitioners of arts the Torah of Moses classified as abomination, at the house where Jesus was. That is what is being celebrated. And the feast has never been introduced to its congregations in those terms. Let me bring the witnesses together, 3 of them. Independent, spanning 25 centuries of scholarship, scripture, and historical method. Witness 1, the ancient historians, Herodotus, Strabo, Pliny the Elder. The word magoi has a specific documented meaning in the ancient world. Every major historian who used it agreed on what it meant. Zoroastrian priest astrologers, practitioners of celestial interpretation, men whose professional identity was built on exactly what the Torah of Moses classified as toevah, abomination. Witness 2, the Torah of Matthew, Deuteronomy 18, Leviticus 19. The same scriptures Matthew cites more than 40 times throughout his gospel. The texts his Jewish audience knew by memory explicitly condemn the professional practice of the men Matthew places at the center of his opening scene. Matthew knew those passages. He used them elsewhere. He placed the Magi there anyway. Witness 3, Raymond Brown, Sulpician priest and Johns Hopkins professor. 752 pages of historical critical analysis. Conclusion: Matthew designed this. The episode is theological construction. The pagan outsiders receive what the religious insiders miss. The scribes know the scripture and send Herod. The astrologers know the sky and find the house. 3 witnesses, none of them fringe. The historians, the scripture, the scholarship, and they converge on the same point. Matthew opened the most Jewish of the 4 Gospels by making the revelation of the Messiah first available to people who, by the law that Gospel quotes throughout, had no right to receive it. The scribes and chief priests sit in Jerusalem with the exact text in their hands. They know the answer. They go nowhere. The men who read the sky, the ones whose art Moses called an abomination, follow the light to the house and bow down. Spinoza understood the structure of this better than most. He was excommunicated for applying this kind of empirical reading to texts the institution needed to remain unexamined. He published under a false name with a false city because he understood what honest questions cost. The harem did not stop his method. The method survived him, and it keeps arriving at the same place. The institution has been celebrating a theological scandal for 2,000 years and calling it a children's story. The pagan priests who practiced forbidden astrology are the heroes of Matthew's opening chapter. The religious authorities who had the book memorized are the ones who sent the soldiers. Matthew knew exactly what he was writing. The church translated it away one word at a time. Make of that what you will.